Jock Finlayson has spent more than 3 decades as one of Canada's top economic analysts and commentators. For many years, he was the voice of the Business Council of British Columbia. Reporters and politicians alike seek him out for advice on public policy. As I confess, have I. Jock is the author of 2 books and hundreds of op-eds, often challenging the status quo, and he is fearless in expressing his opinions. He recently served on a federal provincial panel examining one of Canada's thorniest challenges, housing affordability. We know much about the public Jock Finlayson. Let's meet the man behind the numbers. Jock, I have to say, first of all, thank you so much for all of the advice and help you've given me personally whenever I needed some data or research to back up an argument. You've always been so generous with your time. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's me and also the people I work with. It's kind of a team effort, but appreciate that.
And so where did this interest in economics and finance come from? Were your parents in those fields?
No, my parents were small-town merchants in the Comox Valley, and they weren't. The family wasn't educated. So, I honestly I puzzle to provide much of an answer to it. I remember as a teenager, I think it must have been a high school teacher or even a junior high school teacher got me interested in what I would call world affairs. So not just Canada, but what was happening in the wider world. And I got a subscription to the Manchester Guardian Weekly when my parents got it for me when I was like 13 or 14. They were puzzled, as to why their kid wanted to read this funny-looking kind of British newspaper that came in the mail. It always arrived kind of 2 weeks late, right, from whatever the news was. And it was kind of it's a bit like The Economist magazine is now. It was kind of a compendium of what's been going on in the world, not just the UK. So I devoured that thing, like from cover to cover every week. So that kind of opened my eyes to life outside the small sort of town that I grew up in. And I then, kind of gravitated toward an interest in really politics, government, and economics, kind of combined those 3. So
you must have been a numbers guy all the way.
Less so at the beginning. I was good at math, but I didn't really think about it in those terms, but when I needed to use numbers and develop some facility, I did that. But a lot of the economists that I really have been influenced by in terms of their writings are not the sort of modern quantitative economic theorists. They're more what I would call political economists. I really see my intellectual interest has always been at the sort of intersection of markets and the state.
Well, that's probably an explanation for why you're called a master communicator, because you take numbers, but you lift them off the page until they mean something about the society we're living in.
I think working in the business community, worked for 25 years or more with the Business Council of BC, that honed whatever skill I have in that area, because obviously our members, the executives of these companies, and you've been at some of our meetings, they don't come to these meetings to hear a bunch of numbers, thrown at them and equations or whatever. They're there to really get a distillation of what's going on and what are the sort of highlights and key implications.
One of the characteristics that has always impressed me about you is you're fearless, and you have confidence in your conclusions and your beliefs. And I've seen you stand up to a politician who is not saying correct things. Mm-hmm. And you're not afraid to call it and go, actually, that's not correct.
It's not always the most pleasant place to be, but yeah, I mean, my work, I've tried to reflect what I think makes sense for the business community, not necessarily the government, and don't speak for the entire population of the province, obviously, but looking at policy decisions or actions of government through the lens of what are they doing to the business environment in the province? That's always the lens that I've tried to use. So sometimes, including as recently as last week, we end up using that lens to say something critical about what's going on in government. And we we sometimes take a few lumps for that, but it goes with the territory. You know, you mentioned a minute ago that I'm always confident in my conclusions. I wouldn't totally agree with that. I mean, you know, there's a fair amount of guesswork involved and uncertainty in all the stuff we're looking at. So you got to be open to the possibility that you're wrong. It seems to be. I remember when we had younger staff, I would tell them, spend some time not reading stuff that already agrees with your view of the world, but spend some time looking at literature or think tank reports that come from a different perspective. So you develop some appreciation for how other people see the world. Because I think without that, you can get kind of in a funnel, a bit of intellectual prison. So I've always tried to guard against that.
So give me an example where you were wrong.
Well, we've often been wrong in our economic forecasting. Just right now, for example, I would have said, we did say, back in the beginning of 2022, as the Bank of Canada and the U.S. Fed started to crank interest rates up in an unprecedented way, that it would be felt through a very material slowdown in economic activity, not immediately, but certainly within 6 to 12 months. And we really haven't seen that. We've seen interest rates going up and up and up. You know, long-term mortgages are now 7% in the United States. They were less than 2% when the Fed started hiking. And I think a lot of economists, including our own forecasting team, thought we would be seeing a much more material slowdown in the economy, and it hasn't happened. So you got to, you step back a bit and say, where did you go wrong? It's not just me, but in this case. Another big mistake we made is when COVID hit, it was such an unprecedented shock to the economy. You remember we went from 4% to 15% unemployment in a matter of 3 or 4 months. And governments, of course, were responding with unprecedented wartime kind of fiscal stimulus. Central banks, cut interest rates to zero almost immediately. And there was a sense of the world, in turmoil. And we predicted at that time that coming out of COVID, I remember writing this, coming out of COVID, our governments would get back to basics very quickly. They would focus on the economic fundamentals, the well-being of households, and there would be less of a priority put on what we called social and environmental kind of imperatives. And I would say, looking back, with the benefit of 3 or 4 years, that forecast was wrong, very wrong. So we just don't see that shift, certainly not in Canada, and that does surprise me.
And why do you think? Just because it's easier to give out money than worry about fiscal responsibility?
I think the long period of incredibly low interest rates, Fed, and you're a former finance minister, you're well aware of the backdrop here, but I remember Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister and the current Canadian Finance Minister, with her 2021 budget. I'll never forget listening to her on it, and she boldly asserted that because the cost of money was at an all-time low, it was an absolute responsibility for the government of Canada to borrow and spend, she didn't use this term, but essentially without limit. Now is the time to double down and just do everything we want to possibly do, because we can borrow money long-term at incredibly low rates, and it's almost free. And that ideology is stuck with Mr. Trudeau's government to some extent, even as the financial environment has shifted. But for whatever reason, and I don't purport to understand it, a large part of our political class in Canada, certainly in this province, and I would say nationally, is quite disinterested in what I would call the economic fundamentals. They either don't think they're important, or they think they'll take care of themselves, and they can spend their time and energy working on other files. Priorities are climate, social equity, reconciliation, and combating racism. All things are very important, but you think trying to get some economic growth so that incomes would go up would be just as important as those things. And at the moment in this country, that doesn't seem to be the case. So that puzzles me, and it was not what I would have expected 4 or 5 years ago.
So put on your forecaster's hat, since that is part of your career. And now that we know how we came out of COVID and there wasn't this sense of fiscal urgency, where do we go from here?
I think Canada, and I don't want to be overly critical of Canada, there's lots of other countries facing, broadly similar challenges. Well, I would say we are stagnating. Economically, if the key measure we look at is economic output per person, or what we call GDP per person, which eventually translates into income per person, that is completely adjusted for inflation. That's completely flatlined in Canada. So we're by the time we get to 2025, we will have, one of my colleagues just did a blog on this. I mean, we will probably have had a decade of more or less stagnation in real income per person. That's not good, it seems to me, especially at a time when people are worried about housing costs and other things.
And yet the politicians stand up and say GDP growth is up.
Yeah, well, it's yes, and we can't blame them for looking at the data through a favorable lens. But yeah, they talk about, Ottawa has what I call denominator blindness. So they look at the growth of retail sales or total economic activity, but they never talk about the denominator, which is the population. And of course, Canada has got by far the fastest growing population of any major advanced economy right now. And so far, the acceleration of population growth is not translating into gains in what I would call material living standards. So, and people are beginning to wake up to that. You've seen a real attention shift to that issue in the last 6 months, by the media. The Globe and Mail, which, I would say has been very supportive of the Trudeau government, broadly speaking, they've really turned on this, onto this issue in the last 6 months. And even the Toronto Star, which when I lived in Ontario was a house propaganda sheet for the Liberal Party of Canada, essentially. Even they're starting to run stories on it. So it's finally dawning on people that, economic growth needs to be looked at in the context of your population. Economists sometimes talk about the factors of production, right? Capital, labor, land, it used to be. But there's a really critical one missing there, which is entrepreneurial talent and ambition. That's actually the rarest, scarcest, in my view, most precious factor of production, is the entrepreneurs who have the talent and the ambition to build businesses, build, industries, build enterprises, build communities. And those people are, in my view, are absolutely foundational to economic success and well-being. But they get relatively little attention outside of the business community itself. So I think that's how many people sitting around the current cabinet in Victoria, and I don't want to pick on them, but for that matter, the federal cabinet, how many of them really have much of an appreciation for the role of entrepreneurs in building BC, for example, historically, and even today? I would say very few. It's not a top of mind concern. It's not that they're against entrepreneurs, it just doesn't occur to them that entrepreneurship is important. They think what's important is government and government programs and government, turning the dials and pushing the levers on things, that's what creates success. Government has a role in that, but I think it's vastly exaggerated.
Comes back to the point that you made. So few people who are in governing positions as politicians are from the business world. And so it's not their fault that they have not had that experience, but nonetheless, they don't have that experience. So why don't more business people run?
Well, I think, how long have we got to? I think people are busy and enjoying, their private lives. The remuneration for public service jobs, whether it's at the elected level or the non-elected level, is not appealing to people who are financially motivated. The other factor, I think, is the environment in which they're operating has become unforgiving and harsh. So it's a pretty big step to take for someone who's got an enjoyable and successful private life to venture out into this public and political domain where you're going to become a focus of all kinds of attacks and sort of unhinged commentary. And just to try and make the province a better place, which I believe the vast majority of our elected people are genuinely trying to do. Whether I agree with the steps they're taking or not doesn't matter. But you would know better than me, but the environment in the years since you were an elected person it was challenging then. I would say it's gotten a lot worse for the people that are actually in these jobs. And I think it's something to worry about. That and the role of social media in, I think, almost undermining democracy to some extent and civilized discourse by creating these. First of all, it allows people to articulate extreme positions anonymously, and that gets thrown out there into the chatterverse. And there's enormous amounts of it. I don't pay attention to it, but I know it's out there. And the problems we've got are, I wouldn't say they're intractable, but they're extremely challenging to grapple with analytically, let alone trying to solve them. There's not a lot of short-term wins in that world. If you mentioned Chrétien, the Chrétien years, and I would say I lean to the federal conservative side, but I would say Chrétien, looking back, was probably one of the best prime ministers we've had in my lifetime for sure. Partly because he left the country in way better shape than he inherited it, and that's a kind of an acid test.
Well, whether you want to or not, you are a public figure. So have you felt that you've been made a victim on social media? I mean, are the attacks personal? Do you get that?
A little bit, but listen, compared to the people in elected office, I'm not. I mean, it's trivial. What policy wonks and media commentators put up with is small beer, by comparison. It's the folks that are, that are in the news, making the decisions, running government, even sitting on the school board in Langley or Duncan. I mean, it doesn't have to be a senior level government. I mean, the vituperative abuse that is heaped on a lot of these public figures, elected office figures in particular, is, I think, quite unprecedented. So it discourages some folks, I'm sure, from wanting to step forward.
How successful do you feel that you've been able to be in terms of influencing public policy? Because I've seen the journalism and political side, and there are theories about whether you should go to quiet meetings with the Premier or the Prime Minister and get them to try and understand what you're doing and then be fairly silent in public, or the reverse, go at them in public to try and get a push towards public policy.
It's a great question. How successful? I mean, at best, modest, and that's probably being overly generous. The political world has moved in a populist direction, not just here. We see it in many of the Western democracies, and that's changed the game, I think, to some extent. And in this populist era, you probably need to be more vocal and more visible, and therefore more critical. That has not been the predominant pattern that I've, during my career. We would be mostly private and then occasional forays out into newspaper op-eds, but not attacking government in a political way. It's more kind of offering advice. But I think that's maybe in decline, and there's a push for more populist kind of advocacy strategies, which makes me glad I'm retiring, because I'm not really cut out for that.
And I think probably that reaction is because sometimes these private sessions with leaders aren't working.
Yeah. I mean, we have lots of frustrations in the business world, especially in the last decade or so, I would say. And it's not just that we struggle to have our issues get traction. It's the loss of interest in the fundamentals that I mentioned a few minutes ago that I see among a lot of the members of the political class in Canada, and certainly here in BC, which is a bit puzzling to me. By the way, having said that, I think we are going to see some real weakening in the job market in this environment that we're in Canada today. And in BC, just one piece of data that people watching the show might be surprised by: private sector jobs in British Columbia today, the middle of 2023, we have fewer private sector jobs today than we did in 2019 in British Columbia, even though we've had lots of population growth and a fair amount of growth in the labor force. All of the employment growth on that particular measure has actually been in the public sector. So I would argue that's not a sustainable pathway, and that's something you'll see coming out a bit more in the news media in the coming months. So,
Jock, you went to Yale and spent some time back east, but you decided to come back to BC, and this has been your base. Why?
Well, I was from here originally, and my wife, Marlene, is from BC as well, born in Kamloops, and went to UBC like me. So, a lot of our friends and family connections were here. We lived in Ottawa, and Ottawa has lots of appeal, but Vancouver's better. And I remember my going away party, or my going away dinner, when we left Ottawa, all my friends in Ottawa, none of whom were from here, they were all envious that we were getting to pack up and move to Vancouver. So there was that, and then there was the job that I was offered at the time, which was very, kind of appealing. But we flew from Toronto to Vancouver in like mid-January of 1995, I think, and we flew out of a snowstorm in Toronto, and the flight was delayed for like an hour, and we landed into blazing sunshine and sort of 15 Celsius weather, which was an anomaly in Vancouver. And I always remember my wife looking out the window of the plane, she's saying, we made the right decision. So.
And here you stayed.
Yeah.
But you, of course, have kept up your contacts back east, especially with the Bank of Canada. You were on their board for 6 years.
7, actually.
7 years. And so they are under fire, the Fed in the States and the Bank of Canada here.
I do agree with you. Monetary policy has suddenly, become front page news. Politicians are throwing darts at the central banks. I think that's understandable to some extent because, let's face it, they blew it with respect to inflation. They miscalibrated the setting of monetary policy, not just here, but in the US, the UK, Australia, and elsewhere. They thought the inflation pressures building in 2021 were short-term and they would dissipate, and that turned out to be wrong. Actually, I believe that too, so there was another one where we were wrong on. And inflation threatened to get out of control. It averaged almost 7% in Canada in 2022, and our target is 2%. So it was, 3 times above that. And then the central bank here and in the US, because they're operating more or less in tandem, responded with very aggressive rate hikes, which a lot of people don't like. And so that's brought them, but it goes with the territory. If you're the governor of the central bank and you're going through a period where you're jacking up interest rates to tighten monetary policy, you're going to come in for a lot of abuse. It would have been true before. It's more true today in our populist era where there's less respect for the institution.
Well, as you say, a lot of work still to be done.
Yeah.
You use that awful word retire early. I hope that you're not going to retire.
Well, I've had a great career at the Business Council BC, just a fantastic team of people we work with. It's been a real privilege in terms of the exposure I've had into the business community in BC, trying to understand the different industries that make the province tick, getting to know some of our top entrepreneurs. So I really, really enjoyed that. But I've been there a long time, and we've got some new people coming in. So it's a good time for me to move on from the organization. I'll still be active, but in a different
Move on
setting.
Is fine.
Yeah,
Retired,
yeah,
no.
yeah. I can't fully afford. No, just kidding. No, I want to stay. I don't have grandchildren. I don't play golf, so I'll probably stay working for a few more years part-time.
Thank you for everything you've done, both personally and also for the whole community.
Well, thank you for inviting me on, and also for all the great things you've done for the country and the province.
Thanks, Doug. A BC legend, Jock Finlayson.